We will record this so that we can share it on the iOS, the Illinois Ornithological Society's I guess it's our Facebook page, not our Facebook, I'm sorry, our YouTube page. So if you don't want your face on camera, feel free to take yourself off. I want to introduce myself. I'm Andrea Tolsman with the Illinois Ornithological Society, and we are very excited to continue with our speaker series that we do periodically. And tonight we're going to be talking about the piping plovers in their wintering grounds. We're all very familiar with the story of Monty and Rose here in Chicago and in the Chicago area. And so we know what they do in the summertime, but it's also interesting to learn more about what they're doing the rest of the year. So that's what we'll be focusing on tonight. And I want to introduce our panelists. So first we have Melissa Chaplin. She is from South Carolina. She is an endangered species biologist and recovery team lead from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, focusing on the southeast part of the United States. And next we have Kristen Vale. She's from the Texas Coastal, she is the Texas Coastal Program Coordinator from the American Bird Conservancy out of the Houston area in Texas. And then Tamima Atani, who is our own lead volunteer coordinator for the Chicago Piping Plover program. And she's going to moderate tonight. We'll be monitoring the chat. Feel free to ask questions in the chat, but we are probably going to hold questions until the end after we hear everybody talk, and we will leave some time for questions at the end. So you jot them down on your own or jot them, put them in the chat, and we'll keep track of them there. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Melissa to introduce herself and start the program.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you for spending your Thursday evening with me. I'm really happy to be here and talk about piping plovers. I think just to be on the safe side, if it's okay, I'm going to stop my video just to make sure that it doesn't slow down. I recently found out that we're only getting a third of the bandwidth we're paying for. So I just want to make sure that I don't freeze and cause, some problems. So I'm going to do that, and then I'll turn myself back on in just a bit.
Okay.
So what I'm going to be talking to you about tonight is just a lot of work that we've been working on in the Southeast, primarily in South Carolina and Georgia, to kind of figure out some of the things that are affecting plovers when they're spending 8 to 10 months out of the year with us down here. Just making sure it's, are you seeing it advance?
No, it is not advancing right now. It's still sitting on the piping plover puzzle screen. Is that?
Make sure. Apologies here for.
No, that's okay.
There we go.
There we go. We got it now.
So I'm going to just quickly highlight this. I'm sure everybody is fairly familiar, but just in case, just so we're all on the same page, there's 3 populations of piping plovers defined by their breeding areas. And I know that the Great Lakes population is near and dear to everyone's heart. Ours as well down here, and I'll explain why in just a moment. But we do have all 3 here that come to South Carolina. And one of the other amazing things about the piping plovers is that the role that they can also serve for other shorebird species, especially migrating and wintering shorebirds that are spending time in the same areas as well, just because the piping plover is a protected species. So one of the very unique things about piping plovers is their extremely high site fidelity, which can work against them. And I'm going to go into that in a moment. But these birds, they're temperate breeders. They're not traveling long distances like some of the other shorebird species that nest up in the Arctic. And we can see them down here July through May. And we do tend to see a lot larger numbers during migration. And they really love polychaete worms, these worms that live in kind of lower energy flats, and amphipods, which I'll show you a picture of a little bit later, little crustacean-like things. but everything that they do depends on the tide. And so they spend the majority of their time eating when their foraging areas are uncovered, and when they are covered, they spend time resting and preening until their foraging areas uncover again. So as I mentioned, we have all three populations down in the southeast, but and this is just showing just kind of a banding scheme. A lot of people that do resites tend to like to know where some of them are from. And about 98% of the Great Lakes birds are marked. And especially down here, if you see a bird with an orange flag on it, you can bet that it's going to be from the Great Lakes population. So this is just another picture. Some people are not really aware of the banding scheme, and I only show this because the Great Lakes birds, they have what is known as a brood marker combination. And so if they have 3 chicks in a brood, for example, everybody's going to get the same combination, but with a different dot. And then if that bird returns, they'll get a unique a flag and a unique combination so that they can track that bird for the rest of its life. So this was some work done back in 2012 that was just looking at where birds that were banded were showing up within the wintering range. And the main thing that I just want to point out is if you're looking at the gray circle, sorry, it's in this kind of black and white scheme. If you're looking at the gray circle, notice that the largest proportion is in the southeast. And pretty much, so it's covering a bit of Florida, but the Carolinas and Georgia. And this also goes in line with what Alice Van Zoren has put together just based on her resites more recently, when people are reporting back to her where they've been seeing these birds. So again, this is just to highlight how important South Carolina and Georgia are for this really tiny population. So you're probably aware that these birds, this is the smallest population, and they were down to the teens right before they were listed in 1986, and have done a really impressive increase to date. And this most recent breeding season, they had 72 pairs. So there has been an immense amount of time and effort that has gone into getting this population to the numbers that it is today. And of course, I had to include a picture of Monty. So for South Carolina, again, this is keeping in mind, this is a really important area for the Great Lakes. But what I want to say is it's not like Texas, where Kristen's from. We are really large plover sites, especially for wintering birds, where they're spending the core winter months here, are 20 to 30 birds. We can see a lot higher numbers during migration, but we're nothing like Texas. So what I wanted to point out with this graphic is just that the largest local winter populations tend to occur south of Charleston. And really think this has to do with the higher number of inlets and sounds because of the habitats that are available there. And so the other thing I forgot to mention was that besides the Great Lakes population, the majority of the birds that we do have here are from the Atlantic coast. Although we do get birds from the northern Great Plains, they're very, very small proportion compared to the other two. So what I want to do is just kind of talk about 4 pieces of the puzzle that we've been working on for 15 plus years now. Some of it has been recently completed and some of it is ongoing, but just wanted to share with you some of the insights that we started to learn that would really come into play for continuing conservation for these birds. So one of the first things I wanted to start with is some work that we finished back in 2018. And this was a project that included sites from South Carolina and Georgia, which you can see here. And this project was over 5 years, and it was the first time in the shorebird world that we had been able to link disturbance impacts to survival. So just some of the highlights from the study were that true annual survival and the local population growth were lower in the more disturbed areas than in less disturbed areas. And this was really interesting because if you looked at this, if you were just looking at this from a count perspective, you may think that because of their high site fidelity and they're, that they're using these sites year after year, that you're seeing the same birds. But once we were able to do this analysis looking at marked birds, we found out that that was actually not the case, that a lot of these birds were dying and it was just being masked by other birds moving in. Also, the variation that we saw was primarily associated where the bird was spending the majority of its time on the wintering grounds, which makes sense if you think about it, because they're spending 8 to 10 months of their annual cycle in an area, and so what's going on there can definitely drive what's going on with the bird. The other interesting thing that we found was that birds were lighter on more disturbed sites than less disturbed sites. So kind of the take-home sentence that summed this up was that the birds that were associated with the more disturbed habitats were more likely to die. They weren't moving to other sites. So one thing that has been ongoing in different iterations is this flyway-wide look at disturbance to shorebirds, not just piping plovers, but other species as well. And the take-home messages and results from some of this work was that all shorebirds are being affected by human recreational disturbance throughout their complete annual life cycle, and that it does negatively affect the birds. So just to kind of give you a quick, simple graphic of kind of how disturbance can affect these birds year round. This is something that these birds are facing every place that they stop over on their nesting grounds, especially thinking of piping plovers. They're not Arctic nesters, so they're nesting on developed beaches. And depending on the disturbance level, that can either enable more time for feeding or less time, the same for resting. And so if you've got low disturbance and you're able to rest and get the food that you need, you're going to be in pretty good body condition. But the opposite would be true if you're pushed off foraging areas and always interrupted from roosting, then you're not going to be in as good of condition. So these birds are stopping by or spending the winter on our beaches because we have food and lodging, and I like to, especially for outreach purposes, kind of display this as in terms of an interstate exit. But a lot of times it can almost have the, it's not that they're closed necessarily, but just that they're not able to use these areas the way that they need to because they're pushed off of them and always having to respond to a disturbance. So the next step of this work is to dig a little deeper to determine the physiological effects of the disturbance and how it's affecting these birds based on the amount of oxidative stress that they're exposed to. So this has been done a lot in people, but also in birds. And so this was the same process, but we're going to be looking at it for piping plovers. And basically, we were capturing birds to collect blood samples to look at their telomere lengths. Birds with longer telomere lengths would be exposed to less oxidative stress and vice versa. And also to improve sample sizes, we were able to include other species. And interestingly, even though these birds are not sharing breeding areas, remember they're sharing wintering areas, the signal is the same in all species. So the other piece of the puzzle is just trying to figure out habitat quality. And part of that is foraging habitat. So one of the things that we used to do was to collect fecal samples and then look at them for diagnostic pieces and parts to determine what they were eating. The second go round, we are now able to do this through DNA analysis, but also still including some of the taxonomy. And interestingly enough, it has confirmed some of the things we knew and taught us some new things. So piping plovers love to eat amphipods. You can see a picture of them, the little shrimp crustacean looking thing. And you can see in that little pan how small they are. They're stained pink just to enable the taxonomists to see them better when they're sorting them. And the polychaete worms, these are actually pretty small worms compared to what I have seen, but just to give you an indication of that they're a little bit bigger. And then these Nemiridian worms, which is a different type of worm, it actually is pretty large, but it is so soft-bodied that you wouldn't find pieces and parts to identify it. And that's what we were able to find through DNA. And they do eat insects as well. So one of the things that we've linked with the habitat is that, they're preferring certain prey items, and the abundance at some of these sites is amazing. But interestingly, the polychaetes, even though they're less abundant, they're so much larger and have more biomass. And so you could eat, this is 115 amphipods, or you could, pull out either a large Nemiridian or like 2 of the other polychaetes. Another interesting factor is that these certain features that I'm going to show you in just a minute, some of these are higher in the tidal frame, because down here we have a tidal range of 6 to 8 feet. And so the longer it's available, that's obviously very beneficial, especially in disturbed habitats. And then kind of the finer substrates, which would not be found on ocean-facing beaches, are supporting more of that biomass, such as the polychaete worms and Nemiridians, things like that. So real quickly, I just want to show, this is just an example of a star rating system that's very simplified for to kind of give you an idea of foraging habitat quality. So kind of the least, I guess the lower quality, just in terms of time and effort, would be the ocean facing beach flats. And then it goes all the way up to the isolated depressions. So just to give you an example of what these habitats look like. So these ocean facing habitats would just be, your typical sand flat on an ocean beach where you would primarily find amphipods. This is an example of an inlet facing, which doesn't look that much different, but this one is actually on a sound. I should have done a little better job of zooming out a bit. And so it doesn't have the wave energy as much, depending on wind direction. This is an example of what's called a runnel. It's basically kind of this little gully that forms and has some topography in it. And what we found was that apparently these features provide some refugia for the amphipods, potentially with the current and the waves. And so their densities are much higher in these runnel features. And then the same for a little bit better if it's more facing an inlet. And then these sheltered flats, this would be a type of area where you would have more of those finer sediments settling out so that you would have more worms in these type of habitats. And then the semi-isolated depression, this is a picture of it that I took just a few months ago. This is just a really special feature where it's available most, almost at all stages of the tides, and it's very isolated. So all of this work has basically circled back to something that we've always known, but couldn't quite quantify. And it goes back to the importance of inlets and the dynamic features and how these processes create new habitat. So in this little schematic here, the blue circle is circling these swash bars. Some people call them different things, shoals, sandbars, those kinds of things. But in South Carolina, we have a lot of these that form and then start moving onshore and weld to the islands. So here I show you two examples. One, this is Capers Island, where this shoal is forming. You can see how it's attached on one side, but it's still a little bit open. And then below, this is Little Capers Island next to Trenchard's Inlet. A similar process is happening. And what we've been able to do from looking at this for 15 plus years and tracking also piping plover winter population numbers is know that these sites attract birds. And we're starting to figure out why, because anytime you have these features starting to form, that's where you're going to end up having your higher winter populations, at least for a few years. So this is a picture of a few islands. This is a really important complex for us in South Carolina. It's also really important for red knots. But just wanted to kind of, this is more zoomed out with a couple of islands. Wanted to show you how plovers kind of move on these islands. So through band resightings, we've been able to document, how they're moving back and forth between these inlet complexes. And that's one thing that I probably skipped over, is that's where we see our wintering birds, is typically on the ends of the islands at these inlet complexes. And when they're moving back and forth from sites, they're not moving down the island, they're moving back and forth across inlets. So we see these movements like this, but interestingly, during spring migration especially, we do see them using the length of ocean shorelines. And Kiowa Island is one of those beaches in the state where you can see 90 plus piping plovers in a day if you hit it right during spring migration. I wish we had a better idea of what the actual passage population was. So basically knowing how many pass through Kiowa during migration. And then again up here, just showing you another movement from another inlet complex. This is the north end of Kiowa Island. It's a little bird key, is a shorebird and seabird sanctuary, and the tip of Folly Beach, just similar movements. But one thing that I wanted to also point out is the distance. So one thing that we started seeing with our winter birds especially was how far that they were traveling. And again, this is relative to where they are. In South Carolina, they typically do not move as much as they do in other parts of the range, but we've started to be able to document this a little bit better. It was surprising to us that birds that were wintering on DeVoe Bank, which is a sanctuary that is closed to dogs, boat access only, really difficult to get there and anchor unless you know what you're doing. We were very surprised that birds would actually leave DeVoe to go to Seabrook. So that kind of started to clue us in. And this was also something that came out during the survival study, was the lower survival rates that were associated with this inlet complex. But one of the things that has become evident is that it all has to do with habitat quality. So if you look at the picture on the left, back when DeVoe was in its prime, back in the 2005-2006 season, there were 20 birds using that site. And just recently, a few years ago, our lowest numbers, winter numbers, were down to 3. But I want you to kind of look at the differences and how the island looks. And if you remember our little chart that was kind of showing the ranges of habitat quality, notice how back when they had it had so many birds, it was one of the highest qualities with those isolated depressions. And then recently it was pretty much all ocean facing beach flats. So we've started to see that this is explaining a lot of what's going on as far as why some sites have more birds than others. This is just another example of another island further down that also has one of our largest wintering populations. And this, we believe, is a combination of habitat quality, but also disturbance. But you can see that this bird that I saw earlier this season is, flying almost 4 miles back and forth when there is kind of suitable habitat on both ends. So that was a longer distance movement than what we're used to seeing here. So I bring all of that up to close with the link between habitat quality and survival. One of the things that is becoming very apparent is that when birds have access to really high quality habitats, that can mask and is potentially offsetting effects that come up that could either be cold weather events, like we had a recent cold weather snap. Those are notorious for taking out piping plovers, especially down here, and also kind of chronic disturbance. Birds can deal with it a little bit better when they have access to food at all tides or all stages of the tide, things like that can kind of help them compensate. But when habitat quality is really low, that's when it can really make the difference between life and death. And that, especially when it's on the lower end, when they're exposed to more chronic disturbance, that it's more than likely going to mean that bird is going to disappear. It could make it more likely to succumb to disease or potentially be picked off via predation. So these are some of the things that we're still trying to tease apart, but with the widespread disturbance that we see on our beaches, it's really becoming evident that in some of these instances, these habitats have been helping them compensate. And when those aren't available, that's when we're going to potentially lose even more birds. So that was what the final other thing that I wanted to mention is the last piece, and honestly the most important piece, is stewardship. This is a picture, or these are pictures from a recent trapping event for that project that I was mentioning, where we were looking at the physiological impacts. And the picture up here is a steward from Hunting Island. She's got her Audubon vest on. And so it was actually us kind of training and talking to the stewards. But it was an amazing day. There are some other stewards and volunteers in some of the other pictures, just to share with them, see birds up close, since they're spending so much of their time on the beaches and talking to people and helping people to understand why this is such an issue. And one of the things when I first started, there was so much emphasis on breeding birds. Here, we have a few species of shorebirds that nest on our beaches, and so the focus was mainly about breeding season, posting for that. But it's becoming very obvious that birds need management throughout their entire annual cycle because our beaches are so heavily used. And with that, I just wanted to say thanks to everyone that has helped put all this work together. I was not timing myself, but I don't want to take away from Kristen's time. So I'll be happy to answer any questions later. If anyone, just wants to talk piping plovers, I'll be around for a little bit this evening.
Thank you very much, Melissa. It's Tamima. And I just want to mention, if people have questions, please type them in the chat area. use to everyone and type your questions, and then we'll have plenty of time after Kristen's presentation to go through the questions and have a discussion. I know I have a few, Melissa. You know, it was a fascinating talk. Thank you. Kristen, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Let me start sharing. Just yell at me if you can't see that.
We can see it. That's perfect.
Yay. Okay. All right. Howdy, y'all. My name is Kristen Vale. I work with the American Bird Conservancy, and I'm based in the Upper Texas coast. I'm in a suburb around Houston. So I just want to give y'all a little snapshot of some of the movements and challenges of some of the birds, of the piping plovers that we see on the Upper Texas coast. And just kind of share a lot of what I do. I do a lot of beach nesting bird protection during the breeding season, but I also do a lot of piping plover and red knot monitoring in the off season and the non-breeding season. And so we work with some land managers to try to implement some management practices that that help the piping plovers along in the red knots. And so I'm going to share some of the beaches that we work at and a little bit of what they go through. So I just want to share that I am a certified plover lover since 2012. This is a picture of me when I held my very first piping plover for a telemetry project I was assisting with our partners at Coastal Bend Bays and Estuaries program. So this, holding this bird really impacted my life and turned me into a plover lover. And I'm still to this day working with plovers. This is me currently out at one of my sites, East Beach, where Monty would frequent. And so this is me protecting some of the plovers that are nesting there, which we have snowy plovers and Wilson's plovers. So I look at plovers year round, and you can't get enough of them. So the yellow star is where I'm based out of, on the Upper Texas coast. So just wanted to kind of give you a little bit of reference. In Texas, we break up our coastline into sections: the Upper Coast, the Central Coast, and the Lower Texas coast. So, but I do want to kind of just mention how important Texas is for piping plovers. So we have a Texas-sized population of piping plovers. Previous censuses, previous piping plover international censuses estimated that Texas supports about 50% of the winter population. So this graph shows you, this is grabbed from that the 2011 census, and it shows all the coastlines that were surveyed in the winter. And here you can see in Texas, it's 54% estimated. So we had over 2,145 piping plovers seen. So, this all varies, it's all tide dependent a lot of times, how many birds you capture, but past censuses have supported a very similar estimate that we support about 50% of that population. So yeehaw. So I'm just trying to throw that in there. And this map kind of shows you that kind of where they're mostly distributed and where they're in highest abundance. So the Lower Texas coast is where that supports approximately 50% of that population. And then a little bit above the Central Texas coast, we get a lot more. And then here, the yellow star is where I'm based out of. We don't support as much, but from this census, I know that I was able to look at the sites and see how many birds were estimated, and some of them had 0. And I know that for sure they support a lot. So again, it's all tide dependent, a little, it varies, but for the most part, this is pretty reliable data. So, if piping plovers are going to spend the winter in Texas, they have to abide by our Texas rules. So just kind of want to kind of show you, some of the challenges that the piping plovers have to deal with in Texas. So we have an Open Beaches Act, so that all beaches across every single Texas beach is open to the public. So in this photo, you can see there's development in the background, and they are not able to close off that beach just for that development. The public gets to enjoy it just as much as they do, and this is a great, law. And so, in theory, it's good, but there's some challenges sometimes. And then also driving is allowed on most of our beaches. For the most part, almost every single beach, you're allowed to drive pretty much the entire stretch of it. Our beaches are actually designated a Texas highway, and the speed limit is 15 miles an hour, but nobody abides by that. So, these are some of the things to keep in mind about our beaches. And so the areas that where vehicles are not allowed is generally where there's high human conflict. And so there's too much risk of people getting hit by cars. And so this is generally the higher developed areas. And sometimes it's actually even in important bird areas. Yeah, it takes a lot to actually close the beach for birds to vehicles. Again, people would still be able to walk down there, but anyway, so you see here in this photo, there's some bollards, and these, which are just wooden posts. And these wooden posts, I'm going to keep calling them bollards. They're designated beach parking areas, beach access points. So the public gets to at least park on the beach in these small little parking areas, and then they just walk in. So, this some of the beaches in Texas, not very many are like this, but one of the beaches that I work at has a lot of closed areas to vehicles. And then, here's generally what you can find on our beaches where vehicles are allowed. So, where there's potentially like less development, you would think that the birds would have a good go at life, but you have vehicles to actually look out for. And this is actually, some least terns were actually in this photo trying to fledge, and I think they were able to get away, but this kind of gives you a glimpse of what everyday life is for birds on the beach. And so another thing that's happening in Texas is our population is growing immensely, and so are our coastal pressures. So a lot of development, coastlines continue to grow. And so we have beach to bay coastlines just being developed, a lot of canals wanting to be developed. So this is providing much more pressure on our beaches in Texas. And then you also have pressures from large companies, including SpaceX, coming in important coastlines. And I'm going to briefly mention SpaceX at the very end of my presentation. They're located at the lower Texas coast, but it's just important enough for me to mention for this group. So I'm going to zoom into the area that I work at. So I want to kind of show you the map. So you've got Houston at the top left corner of the map. So that's just like the lower half of Houston. So there's still more of the sprawl up there. And Houston is the fourth largest city in the nation. So we have a high amount of pressure on the region that I work at. And I spent a lot of my time on Galveston Island. So that's the middle barrier island in the photo. And Galveston Island is where the majority of Houston goes to visit. So there's a high density of tourists. We have about 8 million tourists every year, but there's only a population of 52,000 people. So there's just constant traffic. So it only takes about an hour to get from Houston to Galveston Island. And so we have adjacent barrier islands or lands, Bolivar Peninsula and Follett's Island. Those are more kind of rural areas, but they are quickly becoming developed. More RV parks, more bayside areas. So those are becoming more and more popular. I just heard on the Bolivar Peninsula, there's an airport being built on the Bolivar Peninsula. So, with us being close to Houston, there's just immense pressure. So I just want to zoom in real quick to this yellow or red circle and talk a little bit more about this important area for birds. So this area is this is the mouth of Galveston Bay. This is the Houston Ship Channel. We also have one of the busiest ports and most, I think ranked number 3 for cargo ships. We have a lot of oil and gas coming through. And so they built these, the North Jetty and the South Jetty in the late 1800s to protect that ship channel for the shipping traffic. And so the North Jetty is 5 miles long, and the South Jetty is 3 miles long. And so the longshore current drops a bunch of sediment in front of that North Jetty and has in turn created some really beautiful habitat for shorebirds. because of these jetties. And these jetties are not going anywhere. This is one of the top producing ports in the nation. So they will do anything and everything to protect this ship channel. But looking at the North Jetty, though, because of all that longshore current sediment depositing there, it creates this wonderful tidal flat areas. And here you can look out, if you're walking on the jetty, you can actually fish off of it. But if you're walking on it to the left, you would see all these avocets and these big tidal areas, and off to the right, you can see the ship channel. So but if you also are interested, need a break for 5 minutes, you can actually watch, this is called the Bolivar Flats Bird Cam. Houston Audubon, they actually own this property, and so they have a webcam that you can go into, look at, and I took a screenshot of it this morning. And this is all of these avocets that are just congregating and feeding. And so during spring migration, there can be up to about 10,000 American avocets feeding and roosting and using this area. So, and you can actually control this camera. So this is a pretty neat tool. So just go to Houston Audubon's website, go to their birding tab, and then click cameras, and then click their Bolivar camera. So keep that in mind. So I just wanted to show you a little bit about the sanctuary. So Bolivar Flat Shorebird Sanctuary is about just shy of 1,200 acres. And it's bordered by another sanctuary called Horseshoe Marsh Bird Sanctuary. And both of these bird sanctuaries are owned by Houston Audubon. So it's a wonderful area. This is located on the Bolivar Peninsula, which is 27 miles long, and 26.5 miles of that peninsula you can drive across the entire stretch. But the very tip of it, they were able to essentially protest and submit a bunch of documentation to provide a permit to block off driving for only half a mile stretch of beach. And it finally was approved, I think in the 60s or 70s. And so there's a half a mile stretch of beach at the very end that provides refuge for thousands of shorebirds. It is designated a Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network site. And so they own all this area except for this red triangle. So I just wanted you to keep that area in mind for a future note. But it's this beautiful sanctuary that supports thousands of birds year round. And it's, piping plovers in particular, this is some recent eBird data. Houston Audubon does a coastal Audubon surveys every 10 days. And this is data from January and February of this year. They documented 109 piping plovers and 113 piping plovers within a 1 mile stretch of beach that they monitor. So those flats are not only important to piping plovers, obviously, but many more shorebirds that are there, and particularly now during the spring migration. And so across from Bolivar Flats is another important area called East Beach. And both of these areas, are at those jetties. And so they create really large areas for birds. Inlets, as we mentioned, inlets become very important for birds. They just deposit a lot of sediment that's perfect for birds. And it was also perfect for Monty. So I had to throw in Monty. So Monty used both of these sites as his territory. So he would, this yellow star indicates where Monty would be during high tide events. So when Bolivar Flats was covered up from the high tide, you can almost always find him there at that yellow star. And then during low tide events, then he would fly over 3 miles across the Houston Ship Channel and go forage at Bolivar Flats with all the other shorebirds. So here's a little photo of Bolivar Flats. I wish I would have taken a photo of all the shorebirds in this photo, but I wanted to give you a glimpse of some of the flats that he was using. The day that I discovered him officially, it was on January 13th that I was able to actually confirm that yes, indeed, the bird that we had been seeing that we thought might be Monty was actually Monty. So it was a very exciting day, and I'm so happy that I was able to figure that out for y'all, because I was just as excited as everybody else. And then Tamima came down, I think it was April, if I'm not mistaken, and she drove all the way from Chicago to Bolivar Flats to find him. And he wasn't there, I think first 2 days that she went there, but I said, well, try East Beach. He might be over there. And she found him at East Beach. And so it's just neat to see, his movements between both of those sites. And so looking a little bit at East Beach, some of the issues there, so East Beach, it's a for the most part, it's the green area is a protected area. It's designated as a conservation area by the Galveston Park Board of Trustees, who manage all of our beaches in Galveston. But it creates this really good nesting area for the plovers and roosting area for all the other birds. But at the same time, it's a parking area, and it's a kind of a beach park that can support over 5,000 vehicles. And so you park in the big parking lot, but then you walk in onto the beach. So, there's different levels of human disturbance here as well. So for the most part, most people stay away from the green circle, but at high times of use and during the summer, there's a lot of disturbances. And of course, the protected area is much more quieter. So a lot of people like to bring their dogs to that area. So we've worked a lot with the Galveston Park Board of Trustees to implement a piping plover management plan here, and we're having great successes. We do a lot of outreach with people out there, and for the most part, people over the years have learned that this is an important area. We have signs that tell you about piping plover. So even though there's some high human use there, it's able to still relatively be pretty protected from everybody. And then here's another area. This is the yellow star is actually, the section of beach where Monty was. So you see next to the yellow star is actually the yellow line where the bollards are. And so Monty he was located just inside the beach where no vehicles were allowed. And so it was just interesting, that birds understand that line, that bollard line means no vehicles versus vehicles. And so this is this is the beach that he would look at. So I just wanted to kind of show you the stretch of beach that he was on, and just kind of normal. Well, I won't say normal, but some of our beaches on the Texas coast are actually pretty narrow. And so that's another issue during high tides. They get squeezed and have to kind of walk around a bunch of people. So it's just, with increased people, they're just going to have to, just more disturbances, so unfortunately. So I just want to mention a couple of threats to these areas. Two of our really important bird areas do have some upcoming threats their way now. This is a photo of the Bolivar Flats Shorebird Sanctuary, that red rectangle that I mentioned. That little area, Houston Audubon was never able to purchase. The landowner would never give in, and he kept that parcel of land, and now he wants to develop it and create it and turn it into a 30 unit home, beach area called the Sanderling. And so recently, within a month ago, there was a call. Houston Audubon called out to everybody to try to stop this development. And so you send a letter out to the Corps of Engineers, and I know it was shared through y'all's outlets. So, and I know some of y'all sent letters against this development. So I just want to say thank you so much for that. We don't know the status of it yet, so I'm sure once that comes out, Houston Audubon will probably send some public notice about this. But this would be really unfortunate, because this is a really quiet area of the peninsula, obviously very important area, and that would just mean more people on their dogs and vehicles, out in that area. And another major threat that's coming our way to both Bolivar Flats and East Beach, and actually pretty much a good section of that coastline, is this coastal barrier. It's a $30 billion proposed project where there's multiple things, but the biggest thing is they want to put these gates across the Houston Ship Channel to stop a storm surge event from going into Galveston Bay and destroying all the oil and gas industries, destroying everybody's second homes, destroying everything. And creating this just chaos. And so these gates, the ship channel is 2 miles wide. So they want to literally put these gates across it where they would actually, on this right, you can actually see those gates. They would drop those gates down into the water to stop that storm surge from going into the bay. And then it's the storm surge that caused most of the damage in our area. Once it goes into the bay, it's got to leave. And so then that's when it creates that overwash across the islands. And then, so they want to stop that. And this has essentially never been done to this scale, but what it's going to do is essentially alter our tides. So we're not going to have those really low tide events, and we're going to probably have higher tide events. It's going to change the salinity. It's going to change our invertebrates. And so it's not going to create those really good foraging areas for the birds at really low tides, and make things more extreme. It's this big mess. It's not great. So this is something that's they're slowly getting funding for. We thought it would never happen because $30 billion, yeah, right, it's never going to happen. But there's more and more people in support of this because they want to protect the port, because the nation depends on our oil and gas. So there's a lot of backing behind this politically, and we're essentially losing this battle. So this is something to keep an eye on. So I just want to kind of show you some results of a radio telemetry study that I assisted with in 2012 and 2013. And this kind of shows you a little bit about the birds' movements, but also shows you some of the important areas and some management that, can be done and is being done to kind of help buffer some of these birds essentially. So we tagged 26 birds across the Bolivar Peninsula and Galveston Island and Fowlitz Island. And so we just want to show you a little bit about the movements between between the birds at Bolivar Flats, the piping plovers. So generally the piping plovers at around Bolivar Flats, they were they had a pretty standard movement. During high tides, they would stay around Bolivar Flats. And then at a really, really low tide event, they would move to the bay side to this new beneficial use area. And so the beach at Bolivar Flats was their territory during high tide. And so then they would go to that beneficial use site. And that year in 2012, this beneficial use site was brand new. It was mitigation for some dredging fill that happened. And so they created these marsh mounds. And we came to find out that we had about 50 piping plovers that would use these marsh mounds during actually, no, this was during high tide event, or I forget now, it's been so long, but they would use this all the time. And so these marsh mounds had these oyster shells on top. And so it created this great camouflage, but it also created some good foraging areas at the edge. And so these marsh mounds we're learning that are quite important for birds, and it's creating some extra feeding and roosting area for the birds. And so over the years, the marsh vegetation grows in. And so some of it becomes not as, you can't use it as much. Maybe the edges aren't as great for foraging, and maybe some of the interior as well, as the vegetation gets too high and, less suitable for the piping plovers. So, and we learned they were going to vegetate these areas. And so we tried to actually tell them, don't vegetate them because this is actually important for them. And so they only vegetated half of it. I mean, pretty much coastal environments, things are going to vegetate themselves. You can almost not vegetate anything. It's going to vegetate itself, and you can save yourself some money. We also learned this at Galveston Island State Park. They had here, Galveston Island State Park is in the middle of the island, and we have almost no driving. Again, this is on the stretch of beach. There was no driving. But the yellow line shows you where the actual park property is. I mean, it is sandwiched between developments. And so the yellow line inside of it is with park property, outside of it is not. And so those piping plovers stayed within that park property almost to a T. If they would venture out if there was like no people on the beach. But their movements were pretty standard. They would high tide, they would be on the beach. And then low tide, they would be out on the bay side directly behind it. And they also had some marsh mounds out there as well. And so we also encouraged the biologists there not to vegetate those areas to allow time for piping plovers, but also for the ground nesting birds like the least terns, Forster's terns, and black skimmers to nest there. And then, but at Galveston Island State Park, another reason why they were so attracted to that area is because they don't rake their beaches. And so they're just purely natural. So it creates this really good roosting area for the birds. And another inlet that's also really important for the birds is the San Luis Pass. So this is the very western end of Galveston. We had a hodgepodge of birds. The colors indicate where we tagged them. And so they would kind of essentially during high tides, they would go to their territories, but at low tides, they would go to the bayside and forage in those bayside flats. And so we would get really large numbers of piping plovers and other shorebirds. But then once we got a little bit more by lower tide, these shoals would come exposed. And then we would get these large groups of piping plovers. We had 43 piping plovers on these shoals. And then and these really extreme low tide events, like in late January, early February, these other shoals come exposed that never get exposed. And so all the birds go deeper into the bay. And then here, this little blue dot is actually 63 piping plovers roosting together on this tiny little oyster reef. And it was just like the most incredible thing. And so I mean, they're just trying to get as far away from people, but also closest to like the best food source. So it was really interesting to see their movements and understand, the habitats they use. We learned a lot from the marsh mounds. And again, like this, so this area there's a lot of pressure to get it developed, but this telemetry study, we showed them that there's important use. And so they actually have stopped 2 development projects so far from just this one study. And so we're trying to get more studies in the area to kind of essentially get a census of our bayside to show, that these bayside flats are just as important and need to be protected. So we've learned that if you can show essentially that almost just one piping plover was used in this area, then it can make development projects a little bit more challenging. So in conjunction with this, I did a thesis I did a linear survey once a week for a whole non-breeding season. And so I just wanted to kind of show you at glance, how the birds congregate on the island. And it just kind of shows you what the birds are doing pretty much coastwide. So this is Galveston Island. And the majority of this section of this beach is no driving. There's only just areas where you can just park on the beach and then just walk to your site. So, there's a lot of human use. There's a lot of people, but there's a few amount of cars. But what we found was there was a lot of piping plovers. Oh, I surveyed a 1 kilometer transect. So this is a red line to show you where that data lines up with on the beach. So what we found was there was a high use of piping plovers. So this is the average number of piping plovers per kilometer per season. So we found a high use of piping plovers squeezed into Galveston Island State Park. And then also another area that was high use was in a lower undeveloped area that had good bayside area foraging habitat. And it was also furthest away from a large beach access point. So we also learned the further you are away from a beach access point, the higher congregation of birds you have. And here, even though there's this transect G18, the left blue arrow, and there was actually a pretty substantial development there, but it was mostly condos, and it wasn't really rented out too often. It was mostly people that owned it. And so it was a relatively smaller development, and the development was further away from the dunes. So they developed it kind of more inland, so to speak. And so there was this nice buffer of dunes between the people and birds. And so we found also an increase of birds there. And just to the left of that was about the only stretch of beach on Galveston Island that vehicles could drive. So it was just interesting to see that they would prefer to be closer, I guess, towards this development, because I think when they were avoiding the vehicles at the very tip, but also, it was creating some good roosting area. So this was just really interesting to see. And then of course, our low areas is where we have most of our development. So the birds are definitely shifting away from people and shifting away from large beach access points. Here, kind of opposite what we saw. We didn't have as high congregations of birds that we did on Galveston Island. The Follett's Island is directly adjacent to Galveston Island, but this is that more rural island, so less development. So, but vehicles can drive the entire stretch of beach. So you pretty much have a steady stream of vehicles, a disturbance pretty much across the whole stretch. The highest reaches that we have, or highest numbers of piping plovers that we had, was closer to the inlet. Again, you know, usually you'll start to see higher numbers of birds towards the inlets. And we also had some furthest away from goods. There's Surfside Beach on the left. So anyway, so I just wanted to kind of show you how, even though, you know, this does have less development than Galveston Island, but I think some of the influences with vehicles, you know, has an impact on the piping plovers as well. So I just want to end real quick. I'm going to go zoom down to the lower Texas coast, and I wanted to point out a pretty important stressor to the piping plovers that they're currently facing, more extreme than, you know, some of the threats that are headed their way on the upper Texas coast. So we're going down to Boca Chica, where the SpaceX operation is currently. They just updated Google Earth to show where the SpaceX launch facility is. So the left arrow on this map shows you where their ground control is. So it's this huge operation. And then to the right is where they actually launch their missiles. And so, but directly all around that is refuge property, there's state park property. It's pristine habitat for shorebirds, for sea turtles, for endangered mammals, the ocelot, the jaguars. So it's this pristine habitat, and somehow SpaceX was able to build their operations in between all this critical habitat. And just recently, so the Coastal Bend Basin Estuaries Program, they monitor all of this site. And so I'm pulling some data from their monitoring. But just recently, this January, they documented 292 piping plovers roosting in one large flock, directly adjacent to the SpaceX, you know, launch site. And here you can see a photo of these piping plovers with one of those rockets in the background. So this is a major threat. There's been a coalition of nonprofits trying to either I wouldn't say stop, but increase enforcement, because they were doing a lot of testing when they shouldn't. They close the section of beach when they shouldn't. They essentially are just doing whatever they want without any repercussions. And so they're trying to make this a little more stricter for them. And so with each one of these testings, most of them explode, and then where they explode is into refuge property and critical habitat. And this photo on the left is another one from Coastal Bend Basin Estuaries Program of a missile that exploded into piping plover habitat. And so they've done some studies, some regular studies, and from 2018 through 2021, they documented a 54% decline in piping plover population estimate within around the Boca Chica area where SpaceX is launching. And so this is really unfortunate and a huge threat to these birds, because, you know, if they're not there, they're getting pushed out, and where they're getting pushed out to is less habitable areas that are, you know, could be increased disturbance. So even though the area around SpaceX is technically protected, it really, you know, protected as federal and state land, there really is pretty much no protection for these birds at this point. And so this is a major threat that is continuing and will continue. And if you see and hear of any calls of action, I highly encourage everybody to write letters. So in a nutshell, those are some of our threats to our piping plovers and some of the life of these birds. So I'll just end there. But you know, I just wanted to, you know, mention that we are doing weekly shorebird surveys in the off season to document these important use areas. And so we still have a good running data. I didn't share that data with you today. I shared old data, but that helped capture kind of how these birds are squeezed into pockets of, land essentially. But we are still working to document those areas, and then as well as continue to work with land managers as much as we can to just, have them have a part in it, become a steward themselves. So I'll stop there, and we can, I can answer questions afterwards. So thank y'all so much.
Thank you, Melissa and Kristen, for these presentation. You do such amazing work in your respective locations to understand what's happening with piping plovers and other shorebirds. And it's certainly information we can learn from as well. But, we like to think that these are our piping plovers, but clearly they're spending a larger amount of time in your areas. And, I have to admit, I'm slightly more depressed after these presentations than I was before them. The challenges are huge. Especially Kristen, what you outlined it's more than a little bit concerning. Let's start with the questions that have already been submitted, and I would encourage other people who have questions to submit them through the chat. Melissa, do you want to comment on the migration timing? I saw that you responded, but do you want to comment on the migration timing? And maybe Kristen can comment on that as well, as to when the timing of plovers going through your respective areas.
Sure. We kind of just passed the peak of migration in South Carolina, and just as many of you know, that just because it's a more contracted migration, that you just see more birds moving through it at one time. And we do not have any numbers like the Texas numbers. So I have never even seen a flock of 100 and plus piping plovers. I was thinking I was going to see one when I was in the Bahamas doing some trapping work, and we didn't find them on the roost that day. So that's still on my life list. But we do know that birds that are going to overwinter at the sites, interestingly, they arrive in August and stay through April. And what's really cool, especially about the Great Lakes birds, is that a lot of times someone here has seen them like a day or two before Alice gets the first report of them. And usually, at least for a few individuals, they tend to arrive right around the same date, which is usually pretty fun, especially if you just are out there at the right time. So I'm forgetting the one that was most recently seen, but with the 2 days later, you can be seeing one in South Carolina, and then and 2 days later, it's back up in Sleeping Bear Dunes or somewhere. So.
Right. And Kristen, in your area, is it similar?
Yeah, similar. So migration, we'll start to see our first piping plovers. I feel like it's starting to get a little bit earlier, like almost July 4th, we can already start seeing piping plovers start coming back. But, that's just like one bird. So, it's probably one that failed, but we start to get really peak in late September is when we really peak. And then by November, like mid-November, we know that they're going to stay. And then March to early April, we're peaking again. So yeah.
All right.
But May 1st, they're pretty much all gone.
Right. There's a question about the protected area at East Galveston Beach, whether that has a physical barrier at all. And just to remind people, that's the area where there's it's a protected area, but there's huge parking lots around it. So the question is whether the area has a physical barrier.
Yes, yeah. So there are bollards, wooden posts all the way around that protected area. So yeah, so that helps protect that people from staying out. They also put a like essentially galvanized chicken wire around a good section of that as well. Our prevailing winds essentially blow all the trash towards that protected area, unfortunately. So they use that galvanized fencing actually as to keep the trash from blowing into that protected area. So that also helps keep people out. So it's pretty well protected. People in the off season, they drive their vehicle in the no driving area, but it's minimal. I report people all the time. I'm sure they get tired of me reporting them, but somebody's got to police the area when nobody else is around.
Melissa, I have a question about, you were talking about the movement of piping plovers, and you mentioned that there are some like on the Vaux barrier and on Hilton Beach. I mean, they'll move like 4 miles from one spot to the other. And I wasn't entirely sure, why they do that. Is it like with tides or, what's driving their movement within a season, right? Did I understand it correctly?
Daily.
Daily.
Yes. And so this is something that we've just started to tease apart. I wish we had a radio telemetry study going on to really see where all they're going. But I had spent a while back with the monitoring at Hilton Head Island, which was the one that I showed you that looked kind of like a shoe. I was crossing the sound that was 3 miles across, surveying, Bay Point over there, because there are plovers that use that area as well, trying to see if there were movements back and forth with the banded birds. We did that for a few seasons. We did not see anything. So we've started to pick back through this information now with kind of a new fresh lens, just based on habitat quality. But I can tell you that I think there's several things involved. I think habitat quality is one thing, but in the instance of Hilton Head, there is really good quality. There's quality roosting areas next to foraging areas at both of those spots, yet this bird has been moving there daily. This bird was changing locations while we were actually out there trapping, and this was before, so it wasn't necessarily because of us. So that is mainly due, I believe, to disturbance, because the one area that is right next to one of the, if I need to pull the picture back up, but there's a little kind of island that has been created, and right next to it is one of the only public beach accesses. And so it's overrun with dogs. Dogs were running all over the flats, pushing shorebirds off. And so I really feel like they're getting pushed off from one site to another. We typically don't see them moving like that, especially if it's a banded individual. We have so many more resightings than we used to have. And so, and there are some, they do form foraging territories on the wintering grounds, and they're pretty particular about their spot, and they seem to know when somebody else has moved in and come out of nowhere to kick them out of it. So it's been pretty surprising that these are, what's going on. So we're kind of in the middle of this, but I suspect it's a combination of being pushed off of these areas, and then also just lower habitat quality in the just like DeVoe Bank that I was showing you. We just never thought they would really need to leave to go, over to a developed island. But when you start looking through the aerial photos, kind of with a new lens of knowing what to look for based on what prey base is going to be present there, it started to help us, understand better that that's one of the main drivers.
And Kristen, so I was curious about your telemetry study as well. What kind of, what were you putting on the birds, and what equipment were you using to track them?
Yeah, it was a low-tech device. Low-tech is the company. And so it was just this tiny little, it was almost kind of like pea size with this antenna on the backside. And so you had to use this epoxy glue that you would move the feathers and put the epoxy glue on it, but it stayed on for like 3 months. So we put them on in late November so that we can assume that all the birds there are wintering birds. And so it stayed on for 3 months, and they all shed once they were starting to molt. So it had no harm to the birds. And so that we 26 birds. And so that one we had to actually drive around and look for the birds. And I had an antenna that it was me and Sid Maddock that a lot of y'all might know. He taught me piping plovers, and so we went around all winter long, and we had to track them every single day. And so and that we found 2 birds that were depredated. We kept scanning and scanning. We hear the beep, and then we saw this white fluff of feathers. And so there was, but good success though. And most of those birds are still around, or most of the birds came back in the next year. And so that was in 2012. We still have a few that are still hanging around right now. So that's, over 10 years. That's pretty good. I mean, they were so site faithful. I mean, it was every day they moved. I mean, it was hardly that they didn't move between, their high tide spot and low tide spot. It was so fascinating. And it was neat to find those gem spots at really low tide events. And those were really important to discover so that we can protect those as well from any kind of development. Or that one of the San Luis Pass area is one of our last natural passes in Texas that has not been implemented by man. There's a bridge over it, but that's it. But they want to dredge all that spoil area where the birds are using. And so that telemetry study stopped that dredge project. And those shoals are actually growing. And so now it's at high tide, those shoals are even exposed. So it's actually providing even a safer spot for those birds now, because, people are on the beach with their dogs or vehicles, and the birds can use those shoals with almost little access. I mean, boat and kayak, but that's minimal. So that telemetry study was, it's worth trying at least.
There's a question about whether, so there's a site on Facebook where people can, it's called the Florida Banded Bird Sightings. And there was a question whether there's a similar site for Texas birds to see if any of our Great Lake birds are there.
Remind me the question. I think I know what you said. I was
there's a Facebook page that posts all the Great Lakes birds that have been spotted there, and there's a question whether there's a similar Facebook page for Texas birds that are spotted, banded plovers that are spotted in Texas.
Okay, thank you. Not that I know of, not for Texas, but that's a good idea. But I do know of the bandedbirds.org, where you can actually, you can put in any banded bird, any shorebird with a unique marker, like a alphanumeric or like letter number or just numbers, and you can put that in, and it'll show you where that bird has been seen in its journey. So bandedbird.org, and it kind of tracks the bird in a way. That's the only thing that I know of. And I know of a lot of people, a lot of shorebird biologists that use those like color bands, unique, alphanumeric bands with the actual code on it. They've started to use that as a way of getting resites, because you can kind of get instant data, and it's interesting for people too, for resiting it. Like they get to kind of see this bird's journey throughout its life, as long as people are reporting to that website.
So you said bandedbird.org.
Yes, I'm gonna put it in the chat right now.
Sure. Oh, I wasn't aware of it, so thank you for that.
Yes, I forget about it myself.
That's great.
There's a lot of red knot data. I would say that's where a lot of red knot, but there's piping plover, I think, resites on there, I think.
Kristen, this development that's proposed for Bolivar Flats, that red rectangle that you showed, I mean, knowing how things go generally, not just in Texas, but anywhere, it sounds like this will likely succeed as a development project. Is that correct?
Yes, we think so. This landowner has been very sneaky. He previously we're almost certain was some really nice wetlands that he was actually filling in. And Houston Audubon reported it to the Corps, to notify, like, we're pretty sure he's filling in wetlands because he wants this development. And so now I think it was to show for the Corps permit, like, hey, we don't have any wetlands, or not a lot. I mean, they are proposing to fill in some, but we think it's less than what was there before. So I think that there was a lot of push. There was a lot of people shared that announcement. So I just hope that there was a decent amount of people against it. But yeah, I feel like it's going to happen. It's been something they've been trying for a while.
So the question will be whether you can limit the damage, right? Like include buffers and.
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah, it's so unfortunate because literally everything around him is all Houston Audubon property. So like there's no, they're going to use that for the development's advantage. Like, you're surrounded by a sanctuary, but there's really no other buffer for us. But yes, I think they were going to develop 30 acres of the 39-acre tract of land. So they might have been putting in their own little buffer as maybe a requirement. But I'm very sad about this one. I mean, on top of that, the barrier that wants to go through the gates of the Houston Ship Channel, that's going to also have some major impacts to our bay. I think it's essentially going to kill off the bay within that general area of those gates, because it's going to change the salinity and tide so much that it's essentially not going to, provide good foraging area for these huge flocks of birds anymore. And they're moving forward with a lot of this without even really good environmental data to support or show like that it's not going to have an impact. There's basically everything saying that it is going to have an impact.
So Boulevard Flats will essentially no longer be viable. That's
kind of my impression, because I think that there's higher tides in that area. So there might be a beach, but it's not going to have like those extensive flats. It is my impression. But there's the Houston Ship Channel now is trying to fight it, because they're squeezing in a lot of these giant cargo ships into these tiny little gates, and so they're upset now about it. So we hope that maybe there'll be some hope for us with to help with that. But there's just so many unknowns. Like, they're moving forward with this at such a fast pace because they need to protect the area from storms, but they're not taking into account the health of the ecosystem. And I mean, there's a huge, fishing economy, fishing industry, they're going to be impacted just as well. So, yeah, I can go on.
I don't know if I missed any questions, but do folks on the Zoom meeting have any questions that they would like to ask? All right. I really appreciate, Andrea, thank you first and foremost for iOS hosting this webinar.
Absolutely.
It's a topic that a lot of people are passionate about. And Melissa and Kristen, thank you for your presence tonight and your great presentation, as well as all the work you do to protect the piping plovers when they're on their wintering grounds. And hopefully we'll have a blockbuster season this season. And hopefully we'll have some nesting piping plovers in Chicago or Illinois this year. Love to have that.
Yeah, thank you again for doing this tonight. We really appreciate it. Thank you to Mima for coordinating the efforts and getting everyone connected. So we really appreciate all the work you're doing to bring all of these different communities of piping plover lovers and scientists and researchers together. So your advocacy is great. Everyone, thank you. Thanks
Thank you,
for coming.
Thank y'all.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.